The harsh Wyoming wind rattled the window panes of Xavier Nielson's cabin as he shot upright in bed, sweat-drenched and gasping for air. Ruby! The name tore from his throat like a prayer, echoing in the empty darkness of his small homestead. His heart hammered against his ribs as the nightmare faded, leaving only the ghost of her face and the memory of blood-soaked earth beneath a merciless sun. It was 1878, 3 years since Xavier had lost everything in a single afternoon. 3 years of waking to the same nightmare, the same name on his lips, the same hollow ache in his chest. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the rough wooden floor cold beneath his bare feet. Dawn was still hours away, but sleep would not return tonight. Xavier moved to the window, pushing aside the threadbare curtain to stare at the vast emptiness of the Wyoming territory that stretched beyond his small patch of claimed land. Stars glittered like scattered diamonds across the black velvet sky, indifferent to his suffering. He had come west to escape memories, only to find they followed him like loyal hounds. At 32, Xavier had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much. His dark hair hung past his collar, untrimmed for months, and his beard was growing wild. He had once been clean-shaven and proper, back when he had been a respected lawman in Missouri. Back when Ruby had been alive, Ruby Sutton, even thinking her name sent a sharp pain through his chest. She had been everything bright and beautiful in his world, with her copper hair and laughing green eyes. They had been engaged to marry when the Blackwell gang had torn through their town like a tornado, leaving destruction and grief in their wake. Xavier pulled on his clothes mechanically, his mind trapped in memories. He lit the oil lamp on the table and stoked the dying embers in the fireplace until a small flame caught, offering minimal warmth against the late autumn chill. Outside, his horse nickered softly from the lean to shelter. Xavier stepped onto his porch, breathing in the cold, clean air. First light was beginning to tease the eastern horizon, painting the sky in pale pinks and golds. Another day to survive. Another day to carry the weight of his failure. The town of Pine Ridge lay 5 miles to the east, a collection of wooden buildings and dust-filled streets that had sprouted up to service the nearby silver mines and ranches. Xavier avoided it when possible, preferring his solitude, but his supplies were running low. He would need to make the trip today. As the sun climbed higher, Xavier saddled his dun gelding, Chance, and rode toward town. The trail followed a stream for part of the way before cutting through a stand of pines. The morning was quiet except for birdsong and the steady rhythm of Chance's hooves on the hard, packed earth. Pine Ridge came into view as Xavier crested a small rise. It wasn't much, but it was growing. The silver strike 2 years ago had brought an influx of miners, and with them came merchants, saloons, and women of questionable virtue. Xavier had no interest in any of it, but the general store carried what he needed to survive. He tied Chance to the hitching post outside Donovan's general store and pushed through the door. The bell above jangled, announcing his arrival. Old man Donovan glanced up from behind the counter. "Nielson," he said with a nod. "Been a while. Winter's coming," Xavier replied simply. "Need supplies?" Donovan nodded again and went back to sorting nails into small boxes. Xavier moved through the store, selecting flour, coffee, beans, and ammunition. He paused at a shelf of books, his fingers brushing the spine of a leather-bound volume of poetry. Ruby had loved poetry. The door chimed again, and Xavier instinctively stepped deeper into the shadow of the shelf. He preferred not to engage with the townspeople when possible. Their curious glances and whispered speculations about the hermit rancher only made him more determined to keep his distance. "Morning, Miss Sutton," Donovan called, his voice warming considerably. "Beautiful day, ain't it?" Xavier froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. "Sutton, it couldn't be." "Good morning, Mr. Donovan," replied a female voice, soft and melodious with a slight southern lilt. "Yes, it seems autumn has decided to give us one more perfect day before winter settles in." Xavier's heart thundered in his chest. That voice, it was impossible, and yet. Slowly, he stepped out from behind the shelf, his eyes seeking the source of the voice that had haunted his dreams for 3 long years. Standing at the counter was a young woman with copper hair pinned neatly beneath a modest bonnet. She wore a simple blue dress, worn but clean, and carried a small basket over one arm. Ruby. The name escaped his lips as barely more than a whisper, but it seemed to echo through the store like a gunshot. The woman turned, her green eyes widening as they met his. But they were not Ruby's eyes, not exactly. They held no recognition, only surprise and a hint of wariness at being addressed by a stranger. "I'm sorry," she said, her brow furrowing slightly. "Do I know you, sir?" Xavier couldn't speak. She looked so much like Ruby that it stole his breath away, but now that he could see her clearly, he noted the differences. Her face was a bit narrower, her nose slightly more upturned. She was younger, perhaps 21 or 22 to Ruby's 25 when she died. "My apologies, madam," he finally managed. "You reminded me of someone I once knew." Donovan cleared his throat. "Miss Sutton is our new schoolteacher, arrived on the stage last week from Denver." "Rose Sutton," she said, offering a small smile and a slight nod. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Nielson, Xavier Nielson." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty from disuse. "Mr. Nielson has a small spread about 5 miles west," Donovan explained. "Keeps to himself mostly." Rose nodded, her smile remaining polite but her eyes showing curiosity. "Well, it's nice to meet a neighbor, Mr. Nielson. I'm still getting to know everyone in Pine Ridge." Xavier could only stare, his mind struggling to reconcile the ghost of his past with the living woman before him. The resemblance was uncanny, disturbing. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Had grief finally driven him to madness? "Are you well, Mr. Nielson?" Rose asked, concern replacing curiosity in her gaze. "You've gone quite pale." "Fine," he said curtly, turning away. "Just need to finish my shopping." He moved through the store, gathering the rest of his supplies, acutely aware of Rose Sutton's presence. When he approached the counter to pay, she had already completed her transaction and was preparing to leave. "Good day, Mr. Nielson," she said with another polite nod. "Perhaps we'll meet again." Xavier managed a stiff nod in return, watching as she walked out the door, the bell jangling in her wake. His hands trembled as he placed his items on the counter. "Pretty thing, ain't she?" Donovan remarked as he totaled Xavier's purchases. "Smart, too. Town's lucky to have a real educated teacher for the children." Xavier said nothing, counting out coins from his worn leather pouch. "She's staying with Widow Parker for now," Donovan continued, undeterred by Xavier's silence. "Came highly recommended by the school board in Denver. Though I hear she's running from something herself, widowed young, according to Mrs. Parker's gossip. No children of her own." Xavier's head snapped up. "I didn't ask." Donovan raised his bushy eyebrows but wisely stopped talking. He wrapped Xavier's purchases in brown paper and string, then helped him carry them out to his horse. "Storm coming," the storekeeper said, glancing at the western sky where dark clouds were beginning to gather. "Might want to hurry home." Xavier secured his supplies to Chance's saddle and mounted up, his mind still reeling from the encounter. As he rode out of town, he couldn't help glancing toward the small white building that served as Pine Ridge's schoolhouse. A figure in a blue dress stood on the steps, welcoming children inside. Rose Sutton, the same surname as Ruby, the same copper hair and green eyes. It had to be a coincidence, yet the timing seemed too perfect, arriving just as the anniversary of Ruby's death approached. For 3 years, Xavier had been haunted by nightmares, waking with her name on his lips. And now, a woman who could be her twin had appeared in his isolated corner of Wyoming. The wind picked up as Xavier rode home, carrying the promise of rain and perhaps snow. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and dark clouds rolled in from the west, obscuring the mountains. By the time he reached his cabin, the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. He unsaddled Chance and made sure the horse was secure in his shelter with hay and fresh water. Then he hurried inside with his supplies, just as the storm broke in earnest. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the valley. As night fell, the storm grew worse. Wind howled around the cabin's eaves, finding every crack and crevice to send cold drafts inside. Xavier sat before the fire, nursing a cup of coffee laced with whiskey, unable to shake the image of Rose Sutton from his mind. The rational part of him knew she couldn't be Ruby. Ruby was dead. He had held her as she took her last breath, had buried her with his own hands. The wound in his heart had never healed, and he had carried his guilt like a stone ever since. If he had been faster, smarter, braver, she might still be alive, yet the irrational part of him, the part that had been slowly corroded by grief and isolation, whispered dangerous thoughts. What if somehow Ruby had survived? What if she had lost her memory, created a new identity? Or what if Rose was Ruby's sister, come to find the man who had failed to protect her? Xavier drained his cup and poured another, heavier on the whiskey this time. He knew he was being foolish. Rose Sutton was simply a young woman who happened to bear a striking resemblance to his lost love. Nothing more. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the cabin, and something crashed outside. Xavier grabbed his coat and lantern, stepping out into the storm to investigate. The wind nearly tore the door from his grasp as he fought to close it behind him. Rain pelted him, cold and stinging, as he raised the lantern. One of the posts supporting the lean-to had splintered, threatening to collapse the entire structure. Chance whinnied nervously inside. Xavier cursed and hurried to the tool shed, returning with rope and tools. For the next hour, he worked in the driving rain, securing the shelter as best he could in the darkness and storm. By the time he finished, he was soaked to the skin and shivering violently. Back inside, he stripped off his wet clothes and changed, but a bone-deep chill had settled into his body. He built up the fire and wrapped himself in a blanket, but the shivers continued. His head ached and his throat felt raw when he swallowed. With a groan, Xavier realized he was falling ill, something he could ill afford alone out here. He drank more whiskey, hoping it would warm him from the inside and help him sleep. Eventually, he dozed off in the chair before the fire, his dreams once again filled with Ruby's face, only now it shifted between Ruby and Rose, the two women becoming one in his fever-addled mind. When morning came, Xavier could barely stand. The storm had passed, but it had left him with a raging fever. He managed to feed Chance and bring in more firewood, but by midday he was delirious, collapsing onto his bed in exhaustion. In his fevered state, Xavier lost all sense of time. Day blended into night and back again. He dreamed of Ruby, of the Blackwell gang, of gunfire and blood. He called out Ruby's name again and again, reaching for a ghost that remained forever just beyond his grasp. At some point, he became aware of a cool cloth on his forehead, of gentle hands helping him drink water. A soft voice murmured soothing words, and for a moment he believed Ruby had come back to him. "Ruby," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry, so sorry I couldn't save you." "SHH," came the reply, gentle fingers brushing damp hair from his forehead. "Rest now." Xavier struggled to open his eyes to see if it was really her, but the effort was too great. He slipped back into darkness, clinging to the memory of that touch, that voice. When he finally emerged from the fever, weak but lucid, sunlight was streaming through the window. Xavier blinked, trying to orient himself. How long had he been ill? The cabin was tidy, the fire burning steadily in the hearth. A pot of something simmered on the stove, filling the air with the scent of chicken broth, and there, seated in his single chair reading a book, was Rose Sutton. Xavier made a small sound of surprise, and she looked up, her face brightening. "You're awake," she said, closing the book and coming to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" Xavier tried to speak, but broke into a coughing fit instead. Rose quickly poured water from a pitcher into a cup and helped him drink. "What are you doing here?" he finally managed to ask. "Saving your life, apparently," she replied with a slight smile. "Mr. Donovan was concerned when you didn't come to town for nearly 2 weeks. He sent young Tommy Wilson to check on you, and the boy found you delirious with fever. He came for me, knowing I have some nursing experience." 2 weeks? Xavier struggled to sit up, but Rose gently pressed him back. "Nearly that. You've been very ill, Mr. Nielson. Pneumonia, I believe." "You're fortunate to be alive." Xavier stared at her, taking in the tired shadows beneath her eyes, the slight dishevelment of her usually neat hair. "You've been here the whole time," she nodded. "Mrs. Parker comes during the day while I'm teaching, and I return each evening. We couldn't very well leave you alone in such a state." Xavier felt a complex mix of emotions: embarrassment at his helplessness, gratitude for her care, and confusion at why this stranger would go to such lengths for him. "Why?" he asked simply. Rose's cheeks colored slightly. "It's what neighbors do, Mr. Nielson. Besides, you called out for someone named Ruby over and over. It seemed you needed someone to be here when you woke." Xavier looked away, unable to meet her eyes. The similarity between Rose and Ruby was still striking, but now that he was clear-headed, he could see the differences more distinctly. Rose was her own person, not a ghost or a twin. "Thank you," he said gruffly, "but I can manage now." "I'm sure you think so," Rose replied with a touch of firmness in her tone. "But you're still weak and winter has set in properly. There's a foot of snow outside your door, Mr. Nielson. You'll need help for a few more days at least." Before Xavier could argue, she stood and moved to the stove. "You should eat something. I've made chicken broth. It will help your strength return." Too weak to protest further, Xavier watched as she ladled steaming broth into a bowl and brought it to his bedside. When he tried to take it from her, his hands trembled so badly that she kept hold of it. "Allow me," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed and bringing a spoonful to his lips. The situation was mortifying, being spoon-fed like a child by a beautiful woman he barely knew, but Xavier was too hungry and too weak to refuse. The broth was flavorful and warming, settling comfortably in his empty stomach. "Who is Ruby?" Rose asked quietly after several spoonfuls. Xavier stiffened. "No one." Rose's expression showed she didn't believe him, but she didn't press further. "Well, whoever she is, you called for her constantly in your delirium. She must be important to you." "She's dead," Xavier said flatly. 3 years now." Rose's eyes softened with compassion. "I'm sorry, was she your wife?" "She was to be." Xavier didn't know why he was sharing this information with a stranger, except that Rose had spent days caring for him, and he owed her something for that. "We were to be married when she was killed." Rose set the empty bowl aside. "I understand loss, Mr. Nielson. My husband died 2 years ago. That's why I came west to start anew." Xavier studied her face, seeing the shadow of old pain in her eyes. "How did he die?" "Influenza," she replied. "It swept through Denver. Howard was a doctor. He worked tirelessly to save others until he succumbed himself." They sat in silence for a moment, two people united by the common bond of grief. Then Rose stood, smoothing her skirt. "You should rest more," she said. "I'll return this evening after school. Mrs. Parker has left stew for your dinner, and there's more broth for later." "You don't need to come back," Xavier protested. "I've imposed on you enough." Rose gave him a look that reminded him of a schoolteacher dealing with a difficult student. "Mr. Nielson, you nearly died. Your pride can wait until you're fully recovered." With that, she gathered her things, a shawl and a small bag, and moved to the door. She paused with her hand on the latch. "When you called me Ruby in your fever," she said softly, "you begged for forgiveness. Whatever happened, I hope you find peace with it someday." Then she was gone, leaving Xavier alone with her words echoing in his mind. Over the next week, Xavier slowly regained his strength. True to her word, Rose came each evening after school, sometimes bringing small gifts: fresh bread from the bakery, a newspaper from Denver, a book of poetry that reminded him painfully of the ones Ruby had loved. They talked, hesitantly at first, then with growing ease. Rose told him about her childhood in Virginia, her marriage to Howard, her decision to accept the teaching position in Wyoming when she could no longer bear the memories that haunted Denver. Xavier shared little about himself at first, but gradually, he began to open up about his life before his years as a deputy marshal, his plans with Ruby for a small farm in Missouri, how everything had changed in one blood-soaked afternoon. "The Blackwell gang wasn't after Ruby," he explained one evening as they sat before the fire, snow falling gently outside the windows. "They came for me. I'd helped capture 2 of their members the year before, and they wanted revenge. They found it by killing the woman I loved while I watched, helpless." Rose's hand covered his, warm and comforting. "Is that why you blame yourself? Because they targeted you?" Xavier stared into the flames. "I blame myself because I hesitated. When they broke into our home, I had a clear shot at Luther Blackwell, but I hesitated, worried about Ruby in the crossfire. That moment of hesitation cost Ruby her life. You can't know that," Rose said gently. Even if you had taken that shot, the others might have still— I know, Xavier interrupted. In my rational mind, I know, but in my heart— He shook his head. After the funeral, I couldn't stay. Everything in Missouri reminded me of her, of my failure. So I came west as far as I could go to start over, but I never really did, I just existed. Rose was quiet for a long moment. When Howard died, she finally said, I blamed myself too, not for causing his death, but for not appreciating our time together enough. For every petty argument, every moment I chose something else over being with him. It's different from your situation, but guilt is guilt, isn't it? It eats at you no matter the cause. Xavier looked at her then, really looked at her. In the firelight, the resemblance to Ruby was still there, but he could see now that Rose was entirely herself, stronger perhaps, with a quiet determination that Ruby had lacked. Her eyes held wisdom born of suffering, but also a resilience that he admired. How did you move past it? He asked. Rose smiled sadly. I haven't, not completely, but I decided that living half a life was dishonoring Howard's memory. He gave his life helping others. The least I could do was make mine matter. Her words struck Xavier like a physical blow. For 3 years, he had been existing, not living. Would Ruby have wanted that for him? The answer was clear, and it shamed him. As the days passed and winter deepened, Xavier continued to heal not just physically, but emotionally as well. Rose's daily visits became the highlight of his day, and he found himself making small improvements to the cabin in anticipation of her arrival. He shaved his wild beard, trimmed his hair, repaired the broken chair that had sat unused in the corner for months. When he was strong enough, he began accompanying Rose on the ride back to town each evening, unwilling to let her travel alone in the winter darkness. These rides, with the vast star-filled sky above and the pristine snow-covered landscape around them, became precious moments of connection. One evening in late January, as they neared the edge of town, Rose turned to him with an unexpected question. Will you come to the schoolhouse tomorrow? The children are putting on a small performance for the parents, and I'd like you to see it. Xavier hesitated. He hadn't set foot in Pine Ridge proper since falling ill, preferring to wait at the edge of town when escorting Rose home. I don't belong there, he said. The children don't know me, but I do, Rose replied simply, and I'm asking you to come. There was something in her eyes, hope perhaps, or something deeper that made it impossible for Xavier to refuse. What time? Her smile was radiant. 2 o'clock, and wear something nice if you have it. We're trying to make it a special occasion. The next day, Xavier found himself standing awkwardly at the back of the schoolhouse, wearing the one decent shirt and vest he still owned from his previous life. The small room was crowded with parents and townspeople, all chatting amiably as they waited for the children's performance to begin. Rose stood at the front, organizing a group of fidgeting children into some semblance of order. She wore a forest green dress that Xavier hadn't seen before, and her copper hair was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. When she looked up and saw him, her entire face brightened, and she gave a small wave. Something shifted in Xavier's heart in that moment, a loosening of the tight bands of grief that had constrained it for so long. He raised his hand in return, a small smile forming on his lips almost without his permission. The children's performance was charming in its imperfection, poems recited with varying degrees of confidence, simple songs sung with enthusiasm if not accuracy, and a short play about the founding of America that contained several creative historical revisions. Throughout it all, Rose stood to the side, prompting forgotten lines and offering encouraging smiles, her pride in her students evident. When it was over, and the children had been rewarded with cookies and lemonade, Rose made her way through the crowd to where Xavier still stood. Thank you for coming, she said, her cheeks flushed with excitement. What did you think? It was nice, Xavier replied, searching for a better word and failing. The children did well. Rose laughed, a sound that sent a warm current through his veins. They were terrified but brave. Much like their teacher who has never organized such an event before. You couldn't tell, Xavier assured her. You seemed completely in control. A necessary illusion for a teacher, she confided with a conspiratorial smile. Would you like to stay for refreshments, Mrs. Donovan's apple cake is legendary in these parts. Xavier glanced at the crowd, most of whom were still sending curious glances his way. I should go, but I could wait and escort you home later if you'd like. Rose's smile dimmed slightly, but she nodded. I would appreciate that. I should be finished here by 5. Xavier tipped his hat and made his escape, exhaling with relief once he was outside in the cold, clear air. He wasn't ready for full social integration, but he had taken a step, and that was something. True to his word, he returned at 5 to find Rose waiting on the schoolhouse steps, wrapped in her heavy cloak. Did you enjoy the rest of the celebration? He asked as they walked toward where he had left Chance tied. Very much, she replied, though Mrs. Thompson felt it necessary to warn me about you. Xavier stiffened. Did she now? Rose nodded, her expression hard to read in the gathering dusk. She said you were dangerous, a man haunted by violence who would bring only trouble to a respectable woman like myself. A cold knot formed in Xavier's stomach. Perhaps she's right. Is she? Rose stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Are you dangerous, Xavier Nielson? It was the first time she had used his given name, and it affected him more than he cared to admit. I was once, he said honestly. As a lawman, I had to be. I've killed men who needed killing, and I've seen things that would give most people nightmares. But dangerous to you? He shook his head. Never. Rose studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face as if looking for some truth written there. I believe you, she finally said. I told Mrs. Thompson that I'm quite capable of judging a man's character for myself. Thank you very much. Relief flooded through Xavier, followed by a surge of something warmer. And what judgment have you reached, Miss Sutton? A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. That's still being determined, Mr. Nielson, but the preliminary findings are favorable. They continued to the edge of town where Chance waited patiently. Xavier helped Rose mount, then swung up behind her. The ride back to Widow Parker's boarding house was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken possibilities. As February turned to March and the worst of winter began to release its grip on the land, Xavier found himself drawn more and more to town, to the schoolhouse, to Rose. He began helping with repairs around the school, fixing broken desks, patching the leaky roof, building new bookshelves for Rose's growing collection of teaching materials. The townspeople gradually became accustomed to his presence, their wary glances giving way to casual nods of greeting. Xavier discovered that re-entering the world of the living wasn't as painful as he had feared. In fact, there was a quiet satisfaction in being useful again, in having purpose beyond mere survival. One Saturday in mid-March, as Xavier was repairing a broken window at the schoolhouse, Rose approached with 2 cups of coffee. You've done so much for the school, she said, handing him a steaming cup. The children have started calling you Mr. Fix-It-Behind-Your-Back. Xavier accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. It's nothing, keeps my hands busy. It's not nothing, Rose insisted, leaning against the wall beside him. This building was falling apart before you started helping. The town council allocates barely enough money to keep the roof from collapsing, let alone for proper repairs. Xavier sipped his coffee, uncomfortable with her praise but warming to it nonetheless. I've been thinking, he said after a moment. My cabin is too isolated, especially in winter. I nearly died because no one knew I was ill until it was almost too late. Rose watched him carefully, saying nothing. There's a small property for sale on the edge of town, he continued. Nothing fancy, but it has a decent house and enough land for a garden and a few animals. I thought I might inquire about it. You're considering moving to town? Rose asked, her voice carefully neutral. Xavier nodded, focusing intently on fitting the new glass into the window frame. It would be more practical, closer to supplies, easier to get help if needed. Those are very sensible reasons, Rose agreed, a hint of amusement in her tone. Xavier finally looked at her, finding her eyes bright with something that made his heart beat faster. There might be other reasons, he admitted, such as a certain schoolteacher who has made me realize that existing isn't the same as living, he said quietly. A woman who reminds me daily that there can be light after darkness. Rose's breath caught audibly. Xavier, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I know you came here to start a new life, not to get entangled with a broken man who spent years hiding from the world. I want you to know that you've changed things for me, and I'm grateful." Rose set her coffee cup on the windowsill and placed her hand on his arm. "You're not as broken as you think, Xavier Nielson. And I didn't come west expecting not to form attachments. Quite the opposite, I came hoping to find a place where I could belong again." Their eyes held, and in that moment, Xavier felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 long years: hope. Not just the fleeting kind that gets you through another day, but the deep, abiding hope that perhaps life still held possibilities for joy, for connection, for love. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses, several of them, moving fast. Xavier's old instincts kicked in immediately. He set down his tools and moved to the window, peering out at the street. 4 riders were galloping into town, dust rising behind them. Even at a distance, Xavier could see the hard set of their shoulders, the way their hands hovered near their weapons. Trouble. "Stay inside," he told Rose, his voice taking on the commanding tone of his martial days. "Lock the door behind me." "Xavier, just do it," he said, already moving toward the schoolhouse door. "Please?" Outside, the riders had reined in before the saloon. One dismounted, scanning the street with the practiced eye of a man looking for threats. Something about his posture, the way he carried himself, was hauntingly familiar to Xavier. Then the man turned slightly, and Xavier saw his face clearly for the first time in 3 years. Luther Blackwell. Older, with a scar running down his right cheek that hadn't been there before, but unmistakably the man who had murdered Ruby. Xavier's blood ran cold, then hot with a surge of rage so powerful it nearly blinded him. His hand went instinctively to his hip, but he wasn't wearing his gun. It was back at the cabin, unused for years. Luther and his men pushed through the saloon doors, disappearing inside. Xavier stood frozen in the street, his mind racing. What were the Blackwell gang doing in Pine Ridge? It couldn't be coincidence. Had they somehow learned he was here? Were they still seeking to finish what they'd started 3 years ago? The schoolhouse door opened behind him and Rose stepped out, concern etched on her face. "Xavier, what's happening?" Xavier turned to her, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Those men are dangerous, the leader. I know him. He's the one who killed Ruby." Rose's hand flew to her mouth. "Luther Blackwell, here," Xavier nodded grimly. "You know of him." "Everyone in Denver knew of the Blackwell gang," she said. "They robbed the Denver Pacific twice last year. Howard treated one of their victims." Her eyes widened suddenly. "The bank. They must be here for the bank. It's holding the payroll for the Silver Creek mine they're paying the miners tomorrow." Xavier glanced toward the small brick building that served as Pine Ridge's bank. Rose was right, it made perfect sense. The mine payroll would be a tempting target, and Pine Ridge's sheriff was elderly and largely ineffective. "I need my gun," Xavier said, already moving toward where he had left Chance tied behind the schoolhouse. Rose caught his arm. "You can't face them alone. There are 4 of them." "I don't have a choice," Xavier replied. "By the time I ride for help, it will be too late. I know how Blackwell works. They won't wait long once they've surveilled the town." Fear showed clearly in Rose's eyes, but beneath it was understanding. "Be careful," she said, releasing his arm. "I just found you. I'm not ready to lose you." The simple declaration hit Xavier with the force of a physical blow. He cupped her cheek with his hand. "Lock yourself in the schoolhouse. Don't come out until it's over, no matter what you hear. Promise me." Rose nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. On impulse, Xavier leaned forward and kissed her, a brief, fierce meeting of lips that contained all the things he hadn't yet said. Then he mounted Chance and galloped toward his cabin, praying he would have time to return before Blackwell made his move. The ride to his cabin had never seemed so long. Xavier pushed Chance harder than he should have, aware that he might need the horse's strength later but unable to check his urgency. When he finally reached the cabin, he dismounted in a cloud of dust and rushed inside, his gun belt hung on a peg by the door, untouched for months. The Colt revolver felt both foreign and familiar in his hand as he checked that it was loaded. He strapped on the belt, grabbed extra ammunition, and was back on Chance within minutes, racing toward town. As he approached Pine Ridge, Xavier slowed, taking a circuitous route that would bring him to the back of the bank without being seen from the saloon. He left Chance tied in a stand of trees and proceeded on foot, his senses heightened as they hadn't been since his days as a lawman. The bank was still open, though it would close soon for the day. Through the window, Xavier could see the teller talking with an elderly woman while the bank manager sat at his desk reviewing ledgers. No sign of Blackwell or his men yet. Xavier made his way to the sheriff's office, finding it empty except for the deputy, a young man barely out of his teens. "Where's Sheriff Morris?" Xavier demanded. The deputy looked up in surprise. "Out at the Hanson place. Their boy broke his leg and the sheriff went to help bring him to the doctor. Who are you?" "Someone trying to prevent a robbery," Xavier replied. "The Blackwell gang is in town and they're going to hit the bank, likely within the hour." The deputy's eyes widened. "The Blackwell gang here." I should ride for the sheriff." "No time," Xavier said. "They're already in the saloon, probably watching the bank right now. We need to get the people out of the bank quietly and prepare for them." "But I haven't been in a real gunfight," the deputy stammered. Xavier wasn't surprised. Pine Ridge had been peaceful until now. "What's your name, deputy?" Peter Caldwell." "All right, Peter, I was a deputy U.S. Marshal before I came here. I've dealt with men like Blackwell before. Follow my lead and we might get through this without anyone innocent getting hurt." Some of the panic left the young man's eyes, replaced by determination. "What do we do? First, we warn the bank quietly, then we set up positions where we can see them coming. How many other men in town can handle a gun if needed?" "The blacksmith for sure, maybe Mr. Donovan. A couple of the miners staying at the boarding house." "Good, spread the word, but quietly. We don't want to tip them off that we know they're coming." The deputy nodded and slipped out the back door of the office. Xavier checked his gun one more time, then followed, making his way cautiously toward the bank. He entered through the rear door, startling the bank manager. "Mr. Nielson." "What's the meaning of lower your voice?" Xavier commanded quietly. "The Blackwell gang is in town, planning to rob your bank. We need to get you and your customers out quietly right now." The manager's face paled. "The mine payroll, it arrived this morning." "I know, that's why they're here." "Is there a back way out for your customers?" "Through my office, yes." "Good. Start moving them out now, one at a time. Tell them to go straight home and stay inside." As the manager began quietly directing his customers to leave, Xavier positioned himself near a window where he could observe the saloon. It wasn't long before he saw Movement Luther and one of his men exiting, looking up and down the street with casual deliberation that didn't fool Xavier for a moment. They were assessing, planning their approach. The deputy returned, reporting that he had warned the blacksmith and Donovan, both of whom were now armed and watching from concealed positions. "They're coming," Xavier said as Luther and his companion began strolling toward the bank. The other two gang members emerged from the saloon, hanging back slightly but clearly ready to provide support. "What do we do?" the deputy asked, his young face set with determination despite the fear in his eyes. "Let them enter," Xavier said. "We have the advantage of surprise. Once they're inside, we call for their surrender, if they resist." He left the implication hanging. The deputy swallowed hard but nodded. The last customer had been evacuated through the rear door. Only the manager, the teller, Xavier, and the deputy remained in the bank. Xavier positioned himself behind a large desk, motioning for the deputy to take cover on the opposite side of the room. "When they come in, stay calm," Xavier told the bank employees. "Do what they say until I make my move, then drop to the floor immediately. Understand?" Both men nodded nervously. The front door opened and Luther Blackwell strolled in, followed by his companion. Both wore long coats that undoubtedly concealed weapons. Luther's eyes scanned the bank, noting the absence of customers with a slight frown. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said smoothly. "Fine establishment you have here." The manager forced a smile. "Thank you, sir. How may we assist you today?" "I believe you're holding something for me," Luther replied, his hand moving to open his coat. "A rather substantial amount of money." Xavier stood, his gun aimed steadily at Luther's chest. "The only thing waiting for you here is a jail cell, Blackwell." Luther froze, his eyes widening as they fixed on Xavier. For a moment, genuine shock registered on his scarred face, then it was replaced by a cold smile. Well. Deputy Marshal Nielson, I thought you were dead. Disappointed? Xavier asked, his voice hard. Surprised, Luther replied. Last I heard, you'd left Missouri with a bullet in your shoulder and grief in your heart, still mourning that pretty redhead of yours. What was her name? Ruby. Rage surged through Xavier, but he controlled it. That's what Luther wanted to provoke him into making a mistake. Hands where I can see them, both of you. Luther's companion slowly raised his hands, but Luther himself made no move to comply. You know this isn't going to end well, Nielson. I have 2 more men outside and only 1 aging deputy to back you up. 3 armed townsmen as well, Xavier corrected, and I only need 1 bullet for you. Luther's eyes narrowed. Still holding a grudge, I see. It wasn't personal, you know, just business. You interfered with my business, so I interfered with your life. Drop your weapons, Xavier commanded. Now, for a tense moment, no one moved. Then Luther smiled, a cold, calculating expression that Xavier remembered all too well. I don't think so, he said, and in one fluid motion he drew his gun. Xavier fired, his shot hitting Luther in the shoulder and spinning him around. The second outlaw drew and fired at the deputy, who returned fire. Chaos erupted as the bank manager and teller dove for cover. Outside, more gunshots rang out as the remaining Blackwell gang members engaged with the armed townsmen. Xavier kept his focus on Luther, who had taken cover behind a counter, blood staining his coat where Xavier's bullet had struck him. You've improved your aim, Nielson, Luther called out, his voice strained with pain, but you still hesitate too much, should have gone for a kill shot. I want you alive, Xavier replied, to stand trial for Ruby's murder and all the others. Luther laughed a harsh, grating sound. Always the lawman, some things never change. Surrender now, Xavier said. You're wounded and outnumbered. I survived worse odds in Cheyenne last year, Luther shot back, when I put a bullet in that doctor who tried to stop us robbing the Denver Pacific. Xavier froze. What doctor? Some do-gooder from Denver. Sutton, I think his name was, tried to play hero when we robbed the passengers, got himself killed for his trouble. The world seemed to tilt beneath Xavier's feet. Howard Sutton, Rose's husband. Luther Blackwell had killed Rose's husband, just as he had killed Xavier's fiancée. The revelation left Xavier momentarily stunned, and Luther took advantage, rising from his cover to fire. The bullet grazed Xavier's arm, tearing through his shirt and leaving a burning trail across his flesh. Xavier returned fire instinctively, his shot catching Luther in the chest. The outlaw staggered back, surprise replacing the cold calculation in his eyes. He tried to raise his gun again, but his strength was failing. He slumped against the counter, blood spreading across his shirt. Seems like. You got your kill shot. After all, Luther gasped, a bubble of blood forming at the corner of his mouth. Then his eyes glazed over and he slid to the floor. Xavier moved cautiously forward, kicking Luther's gun away before checking for a pulse. There was none. Luther Blackwell was dead. Across the room, the deputy had subdued the second outlaw who had surrendered after taking a bullet in the leg. Outside, the shooting had stopped. You all right, Mr. Nielson? The deputy called. I'm fine, Xavier replied automatically, though his arm burned where the bullet had grazed it. Check outside, see what happened with the others. As the deputy moved toward the door, Xavier stood over Luther's body, a complex storm of emotions churning within him. He had imagined this moment countless times over the past 3 years, Luther Blackwell dead at his feet. He had expected to feel satisfaction, closure, perhaps even peace. Instead, he felt oddly hollow. Ruby was still gone. Nothing could bring her back, not even justice. And now he knew that Rose had suffered the same loss at the same hands. The connection between them was deeper and more painful than he could have imagined. The bank door burst open and Rose rushed in, her face pale with fear. Xavier, she saw the blood on his arm and was immediately at his side. You're hurt. It's nothing. A graze, he assured her, suddenly aware of how close he had come to dying, to leaving her alone again. Rose's eyes moved to Luther's body, widening in recognition. Is that Luther Blackwell? Xavier confirmed. He's dead. Rose stared at the outlaw's still form, her expression unreadable. Did he say anything? About Denver, about Howard? Xavier hesitated, unsure whether to burden her with the knowledge that Luther had been responsible for her husband's death as well. but Rose deserved the truth. He mentioned a doctor named Sutton, he said quietly. During a robbery of the Denver Pacific last year, Rose's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. I always suspected, she whispered. The newspaper reports mentioned the Blackwell gang, but they never confirmed who fired the shot that killed Howard. He was trying to help a wounded passenger when they shot him. Xavier pulled her against him with his uninjured arm, holding her as she trembled. It's over now, he said softly. He can't hurt anyone else. Rose looked up at him, her tear-stained face resolute. Does it help knowing he's gone? Xavier considered the question honestly. Not as much as I thought it would, he admitted, but knowing that he can't cause more families the pain he caused us, that helps. Outside, the town was gathering, drawn by the gunfire. The sheriff had returned and was taking charge of the surviving outlaws. The doctor was tending to the wounded, including the blacksmith who had taken a bullet in the shoulder. Xavier and Rose slipped away from the commotion, walking slowly toward the schoolhouse. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, and a sense of unreality hung over everything, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. What happens now? Rose asked as they reached the schoolhouse steps. Xavier looked down at her, this woman who had brought him back to life when he thought he was beyond saving. Now we decide whether to let the past define our future or to build something new from the ashes he left behind. Rose's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. I've spent 2 years living with ghosts, she said softly. I came west hoping to find a way forward, but I never expected to find someone who understood my loss so completely. When I first saw you, Xavier said, I thought you were Ruby's ghost come to haunt me. Your resemblance to her was uncanny, but now I see that it was just coincidence, a coincidence that perhaps brought us together for a reason. Do you believe in such things? Fate? Rose asked. Xavier had never been a fanciful man, but the events of the past months had shaken his certainty in many things. I believe that sometimes life gives us a second chance when we least expect it, and I believe we would be fools not to take it. Rose smiled then, a smile that contained sadness and hope in equal measure. Howard would have liked you, she said. He always told me that if anything happened to him, he wanted me to find happiness again. Ruby said something similar once, Xavier admitted. I didn't listen. I couldn't imagine loving anyone after her. And now, Rose's voice was barely above a whisper. Xavier lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Now I can't imagine not loving you, Rose Sutton. You brought me back to life. In the weeks that followed, Pine Ridge gradually returned to normal after the excitement of the shootout. The surviving Blackwell gang members were transported to Cheyenne to stand trial for their numerous crimes across the territory. Xavier's actions during the bank robbery earned him the respect of the townspeople, who no longer viewed him as the strange hermit from the cabin in the woods, but as a protector, a man of courage and principle. Xavier did purchase the small property on the edge of town, selling his isolated cabin to a young couple newly arrived from the east. He built a proper barn, planted a vegetable garden, and acquired a milk cow and some chickens. The house itself he repaired and improved, adding a second bedroom, a larger kitchen, and bookshelves to hold Rose's growing collection. As spring blossomed across the land, bringing wildflowers to the prairies and new leaves to the cottonwoods along the creek, Xavier and Rose were married in a simple ceremony in the schoolhouse. The entire town attended, the children Rose taught standing in a neat row, beaming with excitement for their beloved teacher. Rose wore a dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Denver with wildflowers in her copper hair. Xavier, standing before her in a new suit, found himself thinking of Ruby not with the aching grief that had been his companion for so long, but with a gentle remembrance, a gratitude for the love they had shared and the lessons it had taught him. As they spoke their vows, Xavier thought he understood at last what Rose had meant about honoring those they had lost by living fully. Ruby and Howard would always be part of them, threads woven into the fabric of who they were. But the tapestry they were creating together was new, unique, and beautiful in its own right. That night, as they lay together in their new home, Rose curled against his side, her head resting on his chest, Xavier felt a peace he had not known in years. "What are you thinking about?" Rose asked, her voice drowsy with contentment. Xavier stroked her hair, watching as moonlight streaming through the window turned the copper strands to silver. "I was thinking about nightmares," he said. Rose propped herself up on one elbow, looking at him curiously. "Nightmares. For 3 years, I woke almost every night from the same nightmare, Ruby dying, me calling her name," he explained. "The night I fell ill when you found me, I was having that nightmare again, but when I heard your voice, I thought I had died and gone to heaven because heaven sounded exactly like your voice." Rose's eyes softened and she placed her hand against his cheek. "And now, do you still have the nightmares?" Xavier shook his head. "Not since that day. It's as if something was finally laid to rest." "Perhaps something was," Rose said softly. "Perhaps you finally forgave yourself." Xavier covered her hand with his own. "I think you're right, and I have you to thank for that. We healed each other," Rose replied, "and will continue to every day." Outside their window, the Wyoming night stretched vast and star-filled above their small corner of the world. In the distance, a coyote called, its voice rising like a prayer to the moon. Xavier held Rose close, grateful beyond words for second chances, for healing, for love found in the midst of grief. He had wandered lost for so long, haunted by ghosts and regrets. Now, in Rose's arms, he had found his way home, not to the past he had lost, but to a future he had never dared imagine. And as he drifted toward sleep, he knew with absolute certainty that no nightmares would trouble him tonight. Only dreams, bright with promise and possibility, awaited him in the darkness. Dreams of the life they would build together day by day in this wild and beautiful land they both now called home.